All right. So thank you, Jeremy, for coming on the show. Jeremy is an independent journalist, publisher, and editor of the Foreign Policy Journal. He has also written multiple books on the Israeli-Palestinian relationships, economic systems, and lately the sort of vaccine and public health policy, which is what I was hoping to chat with you today about. So yeah, vaccines is such a hot topic, especially during the sort of pandemic, right? How did you get started on this research, Jeremy, and what prompted you to sort of study this in more detail?
Well, when my wife became pregnant in 2012, I started applying the research skills I'd learned in doing journalism, to
Right,
just studying the scientific literature on vaccines. Each vaccine, in order to be able to make informed choices about each one on the CDC schedule specifically. Um, and I had gone into that expecting to find, a lot of differences between what we're told and the public messaging and what the science was really saying. I was unprepared for the chasm I found between what the government and mainstream media tell us, and then the medical establishment tell us, and what the science actually says. These are two completely different things that are irreconcilable. And so it became uh, a passion really to really dig deeply into the science and just learn and consume this knowledge. And then the thing was, I was doing that for myself. I was doing it so that we could make informed choices as parents. But then once I had that knowledge, I couldn't not share it with other people. And so I eventually built
of
up the
course.
courage to start writing about this topic, knowing that, of course, that was going to place a huge target on my back and all kinds of labels like the derogatory anti-vaxxer label and things like this. But it was a moral compulsion that I had to help get this knowledge out there, and I felt
Right, right,
uniquely skilled to be able to help do that.
right. I mean, just after going through some of the articles that sort of you had written, it goes very much against the sort of natural grain of like what we have been thought of in like school, right, or in sort of public literature, that vaccines have had tremendous success with diseases such as like measles, smallpox, polio, etc. Right. So how do you like reconcile your findings with like empirical evidence versus the sort of vast amount of success, let's say, that the sort of vaccines have had, right, throughout like history?
Yeah, well, the first thing is there's kind of a whole myth surrounding vaccines. So, for example, I always believed and we were taught that the reason that these infectious diseases disappeared was because of vaccines. But in fact, it's totally uncontroversial in the scientific literature. That in fact, here I'm getting this straight from the Pediatrics Journal, which is the journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. That 90% of the decline in infectious disease mortality that we saw in the 20th century occurred before the 1940s, before vaccines could possibly help to explain it. So this is completely uncontroversial. You can look at the decline in mortality for pertussis, measles, and all kinds of different so-called vaccine preventable diseases, and they were already declining well before the vaccines were even introduced. And in some cases, the mortality had really been reduced, quite, like measles, for example. There was approximately 450 children who died per year from measles in the U.S. The infection fatality rate was estimated at about 1 in 10,000. So it was, and people didn't view it as, people weren't afraid of measles. Measles was seen the way I saw chickenpox when I was a kid, and I had chickenpox, and it wasn't something like we were deathly afraid of. It was just like, oh, it's chickenpox. It was just kind of like this
Right,
benign illness. For me, it was, I got, it was uncomfortable, itchy rash. I had the pock marks and things that you get. It was itchy. It was uncomfortable. But hey, I was out of school. It was an excuse for me to be out of school. So that's the way I saw it. And this is the way
right,
people viewed measles in the pre-vaccine era. It wasn't something they were deathly afraid of. It was something that it was a virtual rite of passage into adulthood for people to get measles. And it's not that the vaccines aren't effective. The measles vaccine is a highly effective vaccine. There's no question about that. And you can see, it's one thing to talk about the mortality. The population mortality from measles was already very low before the vaccine was introduced. However, you can see the impact on incidence of measles cases declined dramatically after the introduction of the vaccine. And of course, we're supposed to believe that this is a good thing, but there's a big problem with public vaccine policies in that they treat mass vaccination as a one-size-fits-all solution to disease prevention,
Right.
and this is unscientific. You know, every individual is at a different risk from the disease that the vaccine is intended to prevent against, and every individual is at a different risk of harm from the vaccines. And there are effects of vaccines that policymakers simply do not take into consideration. So, for example, there are opportunity costs to vaccines. Measles is a really good example of this. So, oh, that's okay. I would rather stop and fix it than continue and have the
Right.
problem. Um, so policymakers don't consider opportunity costs of vaccines. So what I mean by that is, this is a term that I've applied to vaccinations, taking from economics. It's an economics term. Um,
Right.
so what I mean by that is that by preventing natural immunity, there are costs to that. Because when you have the infection and you get natural immunity to it, that is a superior immunity. Measles, this is known for measles. It's a really good example of the inferiority of vaccine conferred immunity. Number one, it's not as long lasting as natural immunity. And so a good example of an opportunity cost is that in the pre-vaccine era, infants were protected through what's called maternal passive immunity. So the mothers had experienced measles as children. They had gained that robust lifelong immunity from infection. And so as adults, they were able to confer that immunity by passing antibodies through breast milk and through the placenta, prenatally through the placenta, and then postnatally through breast milk, conferring immunity to their infants, so that the infants were protected during the vulnerable period of their life, when those are the highest risk. Infants are at higher risk than like school age children. And so infants were protected, and then adults were, of course, protected because they all had it during childhood. And so there was already a natural herd immunity. And it was herd immunity not in the sense that the virus was gone and it wasn't transmitting, but it did constrain outbreaks, and very importantly, it constrained the age of infection to like school age children. So children, an age when the virus posed a very low risk of complications to individuals. Whereas now,
Right.
the risk to infants in the event of exposure, in the event of an outbreak, is greater than it was then, precisely because of mass vaccination and the population effect, and the effect on the loss of maternal passive immunity. And so there are effects like these that, long-term population effects as well as individual effects that policymakers simply do not consider. Another really important one is non-specific. There's a term for it in the literature. They're called non-specific effects, and these are essentially unintended consequences, whether beneficial or detrimental, unintended, unforeseen consequences of vaccinations, and they're distinct from what are known as adverse events. That pre-licensure study look for adverse events. You get the vaccine and maybe you get a sore shoulder, or maybe you have a fever. These kind of acute reactions that are temporally associated with the vaccination. But they can also have kinds of because scientists really have no understanding of all the effects of these products that are designed to alter the functioning of your immune system. And so, they really don't understand all the effects. And so, a really good example of the dangers of not understanding that, and of marketing vaccines before we've had, clinical trials, randomized controlled trials comparing long-term health outcomes, including all-cause mortality between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals. Without those types of studies, there's any claim to safety and effectiveness is scientifically meaningless. And a really good example is the DTP vaccine, which is the whole cell pertussis vaccine, diphtheria, tetanus, and whole cell pertussis, that is still widely used in developing countries. And the best science that we have, the best studies that we've had to date, show that vaccine is actually associated with an increased rate of childhood mortality. So even though it protects against the 3 target diseases, it appears to kill more children from other causes. So it detrimentally affects their immune systems in ways that might protect them against those 3 target diseases, but makes them more vulnerable to other infections. And so they're dying from other diseases. And
Right.
so this is a good example of an opportunity cost of natural infection because, of course, natural infection, despite the risks of infection, does confer a more robust immunity. And it's also an example of the non-specific effects that vaccines can have, and why we need long-term studies, long-term data on long-term effects, and not just does it prevent the disease or not, but does it prevent the disease, and is it associated with other diseases? We look at the childhood population today. The childhood population, half of our children are chronically ill. This is not acceptable. And the CDC, this Center for Disease Control and Prevention, has utterly failed in its core mission to we're supposed to trust the CDC to take care of our health, and they're charged with maintaining public health. Well, they failed
Right.
completely and totally, miserably. We have a sick population, and the idea that there's really kind of a fundamental philosophy. If you look at the philosophy, the vaccine theory, there's a philosophy behind it. Like there's this fundamental assumption that we're all born with dysfunctional immune systems such that we all require vaccine. This pharmaceutical interventions starting from the first day of our lives with the hepatitis B shot now. Since 1991, in order to maintain good health and for our immune systems to function. I mean, this is ludicrous. I mean, we evolved with functioning immune systems, and if we give our bodies what they need for the immune system to function properly, it will function properly and protect us from disease. And there's benefits conferred by pathogenic challenges, and measles again is a really good example of that. So this also speaks to opportunity costs. So measles infection during childhood is associated with reduced risks of much more serious diseases later in life, such as cardiovascular disease, which is the number one killer in the U.S., right?
Right.
A reduced risk of Hodgkin's lymphoma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, so a reduced risk of cancer. So there's benefits of having these pathogenic challenges, and the idea, this kind of concept that we're just going to eradicate these things called, these germs from the planet, and we're going to eradicate these viruses and these bacteria, and like that's the approach. Is there really needs to be a fundamental paradigm shift in medicine away from this
Right.
pharmacentric approach to like let's figure out how can we instead of like looking at these things as like other, and there's the environment and there's these environmental factors, and instead of looking at that as like something we need to protect ourselves from and like live in this sanitary bubble, we need to figure out like, okay, how can we live in balance and in harmony with our environment, with nature? How can we
Right.
sustain immunity? How can we support our immune systems so that if we are exposed to some potentially pathogenic virus or bacteria, that it's not going to cause severe disease. It's not going to kill us.
Right.
These are the approaches
Right.
that we need to have, but of course everything is so pharmaceutical centric that you can't even talk about these things. Notice the
Right.
CDC never mentions every flu season. Make sure your vitamin D status is sufficient. They never say that.
It's always take the flu shot.
Yeah, yeah, it's you get the flu shot, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
They say that the flu shot is the best, quote unquote, the best way to prevent the flu, from prevent illness from influenza. Well, they don't have any studies
Right.
to support that. They have zero studies to support that statement. It is a completely unscientific statement. Where are all the studies comparing people who just choose to get the flu shot every year and the outcomes for those people compared to people who choose to forego the flu shot but who live healthy lifestyles, who make sure that they sustain vitamin C levels, vitamin D levels, nutrient sufficiency, get good exercise, and just make healthy lifestyle choices. Where are the studies comparing those two choices? They don't exist, and yet the CDC is making these statements without any basis whatsoever.
Right.
And that is really telling. I think that's really instructive as to the problems with the medical establishment, of course, which the government is a big part of the medical establishment. The CDC, the FDA, they are part of the medical establishment, and that's one of the problems.
Right. 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 I mean, you like touched upon a whole set of points there. I just want to like drill down to like one or two
Yep.
points that you sort of made. So the first one is herd immunity, right? And you like spoke about that just now, and you mentioned that people are not given an opportunity to sort of develop their herd immunity by this excessive vaccination program, right? But I mean, there are multiple questions with regards to how herd immunity should develop in like order to sort of combat, for example, the sort of COVID-19 pandemic right now, right? For example, at like what percentage should the sort of low risk populace develop this herd immunity before the sort of higher risk people like the elderly people, 80 plus, etc., should be allowed to now interact with the herd immunity, right? So like that's like question number one. Question number two would be like, for example, and there are no studies to sort of prove that once your natural immune system sort of fights off this the COVID-19 virus, that it cannot be attacked again by the sort of same virus. It's not now. It's not as though our systems become sort of bulletproof, right? They can still be attacked, as is the case with sort of vaccines, right? So, how exactly is like herd immunity supposed to, supposed to is a sort of better or an alternative to the sort of vaccination program? I mean, we constantly hear about this herd immunity and how it might have played a sort of successful role in, say, some Sweden, for like example, right? But like Sweden is a slightly different setup. It's like mostly smaller villages, more like distributed throughout the sort of country, as opposed to like North America, which is mostly like, or not mostly, but has its fair share of like mega cities, right? So I just want to like speak a little bit about how herd immunity may be the sort of better way to sort of combat this pandemic.
Well, they use herd immunity, of course, the term to refer to uh, population immunity, whether from natural immunity or from vaccine conferred immunity. Um, so, but there's a difference, in terms of the immunity you get. So the infection confers. We're told that the vaccines confer immunity that's equivalent to infection, only without having to go through symptoms. When we made choices about our son, we went to the pediatrician's office and we got this information sheet from the CDC, and it says right on there that that's what vaccines do. They confer the same immunity as infection, but without having to get the disease, right? That's a complete lie. It's totally untrue. Vaccines do not confer the same immunity. So, for example, SARS-CoV-2, the COVID-19, the virus that causes COVID-19, the vaccines, so there's two mRNA vaccines that have been approved, not approved by the FDA, but authorized for emergency use by the
Right.
FDA, while clinical trials are still ongoing. So phase 3 trials are not completed yet. They are not licensed, they are not approved. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, what they're designed to do is they inject mRNA into you, this messenger RNA, that then enters your cells and instructs your cells to become factories to produce the what's called the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. So you're mounting an immune response to one epitope of the virus, the spike protein. And that's different from when you're infected and you have the whole virus in your system. And there's more than the spike protein. There's other epitopes of the virus, other parts of the virus that your immune system recognizes and mounts a response to. And so, when it just intuitively, you're going to have a different immune response when you're infected with the virus than when you're just mounting a response to this spike protein that is created by your own cells as a result of the mRNA injection. So that's just intuitive. Intuitively, we can just make the assumption very safely that natural immunity is superior because you're mounting an immune response to the whole virus and not just the one part of it. So you're going to get a broader array of responses. And so that is going to confer a more robust and longer lasting immunity, in all probability. And there's not really studies on that because we're still figuring these things out. But there's a lot of data on natural immunity. And of course, the media throughout the summer, from the spring through the summer, they were all, saying, well, people's antibodies go away rapidly and therefore they lose their immunity. But that was completely false. I shouldn't say completely false. It's true that people, the antibody levels can wane quite rapidly. But the thing is a lot of people became immune even though they never developed a detectable level of antibodies in the first place. And if you think
Oh,
about it,
okay.
people got infected and they recovered from the infection before they even developed antibodies. So there's other
Okay.
mechanisms. There's other immune mechanisms apart from antibodies. The focus is always on antibodies, and that's the focus with vaccines. Vaccines are intended to stimulate your body to produce antibodies. But there's other mechanisms of immunity. There's innate immunity, and then there's another branch of the adaptive immune system, which is cellular immunity, um, which relates to antibody production because there's T cells that are involved in B cell production, which in B cells are what produce antibodies. But there's a whole other branch of that is not involved in the production of antibodies. That's really, really important, especially with SARS-CoV-2. There's so many studies on this now that the cellular immune response, the T cell response, is equally, if not more important than the antibody response. And in fact, high antibody, they talk about the vaccines like, oh, well, if it stimulates a higher level of antibodies, therefore you have stronger immunity. But this is not scientific. In fact, with natural infection, people who have higher antibody levels tend to have more severe disease. So there's
Right.
an association between higher antibody levels and severe disease. And so it seems clear that people who develop more severe disease, it's one of the reasons. It's not that the antibodies are causing more severe disease; it's that their bodies is producing more antibodies because they have some insufficiency, some dysfunction or insufficiency with innate and cellular immunity. That that antibody, that last line of defense, is just ramped up. And so there's this association with that, and then also the cytokine storm, the inflammatory response, where the immune system, it's actually the immune system's response, it's the people's own body's response to the virus infection that is killing people. And so,
Okay.
just because you have, well, like higher antibody titer doesn't mean that that's stronger immunity necessarily. I mean, you might have very robust, long-lasting immunity and not have any antibodies in your system, and then you have cellular memory so that your immune system can remember. I mean, once it learns how to recognize a pathogen, even if you lose your antibodies, it's normal for antibodies to wane and they just disappear. I mean, after you become infected and recovered. But then if you're ever exposed again, your body rapidly mounts, immune responses. You have innate immunity, cellular immunity, and then you quickly produce antibodies again. Your body doesn't have to relearn how to produce those antibodies again. So this idea that, oh, you lose your antibodies and therefore you lose your immunity is completely unscientific. It's totally ludicrous. I mean, and scientists know this, and the fact that they're not speaking out, like saying, well, wait a minute, no, why is the media saying these things? And in fact, you have scientists saying these things. That it just blows my mind that these messages are being propagated to the public when everyone knows it's false. I mean, everyone who knows anything about this knows that those things are false, and yet these lies are just being propagated without any challenge. And so
Right.
it's a big problem that people just don't understand uh, how these things even function, how these things work, how immunity works.
Right. Right. Um, so in terms of like herd immunity, like for example, right, which would be the sort of alternate approach to like, for example, vaccine, the sort of mass vaccine program, right? Like how would that process take place? Like, are there any sort of models to like sort of show us, okay, to, like what percentage of the sort of low risk populace, let's say everybody under like 50 years, for like example, would have to get before they can interact with like the sort of high risk populace. Like how do we then now model the sort of herd immunity, right? Because again, in like terms of like opportunity cost, how do we try to see, okay, with a sort of no restrictions, no like masks, no lockdown, and just depending on herd immunity versus like lockdown, masks, and sort of vaccinations, how do sort of you see these like uh alternative approaches playing out? Like, do you see, or like, do you think that like mass and the sort of lockdowns that we have seen in like North America and especially in like Canada, here in Toronto, they've been like going on for like months on end now, and it's actually quite frustrating for like everybody. But do you sort of see this approach of like masks, lockdowns, and sort of mandatory vaccinations, uh, really try and control this like pandemic, or like do you think that at like some point, we are going to have to switch away from this approach into like a more herd immunity and sort of completely different approach?
Yeah, the approach from the beginning should have been to, I mean, try to protect those people at high risk. I mean, it was very, very clear from the data from very early on in the pandemic that this was a disease that primarily affected elderly people with underlying medical conditions. I mean, that was
Right.
absolutely clear in the data right from the start. And so it was very clear that most of the population, I mean, if you're under 50, for example, and you're healthy, you're just at low risk. And so this idea, so the strategy should have been from the start to protect the people at highest risk while, everyone else got on with their lives and, went to work and was able to provide for the families and put food on the table and pay their bills. And at the same time, that would have built up population immunity.
Yeah. Sorry, can I
If you
cut you off
look at
again?
before the pandemic, at the pandemic planning guidance, from the CDC, from the World Health Organization, countries around the world, the EU, they did not recommend the the policies that were implemented with
Right.
COVID-19. In fact, they recommended against things like quarantining healthy people, universal mask use among the public. I mean, these types of things were advised against. And so when China locked down, and then certain people said, well, we need to do what China has done, and then it was, of course, the Imperial College model that was really influential out of the UK, that persuaded governments to lock down. And this was right from the beginning, right in that paper. I want to point something out. We're talking about herd immunity. So herd immunity is that it's not this concept it's not controversial.
Right.
When I mean natural herd immunity is not controversial. I mean its existence. It's so fundamental. It's such basic epidemiology that it's built into their own models. All right, so it's very basic epidemiology that this phenomenon exists. And that's why there's an epidemic wave, right? It takes on this wave shape. It's because of herd immunity. So, when it's introduced into the population and there's this outbreak, and then the proportion of people susceptible to the infection and disease is inversely proportionate to so the case numbers. So there's an inverse proportion between the people who are susceptible and the people who have already been infected and recovered. Either
Right.
die or recover. And so as the proportion of susceptibles decreases, and then you get the decline in the epidemic. So that's why it takes on that wave shape. And so a sensible policy would have been to try to protect the at-risk population, those at high risk. But what they did instead is they had the suppression, these lockdown measures, trying to, well, initially, of course, if you think about this, we were told initially that the lockdown measures were this a temporary thing. It was 3 weeks to flatten the curve, right? They used the term flatten the
Right.
curve. So if you think about that, they, you know, flatten the curve didn't mean reducing the number of cases. It just meant prolonging the epidemic and postponing the inevitable. So the
Right.
area under the curves was the same either way. It was just, do you have this
Same.
sharp spike or do you have this flatter wave? That was the difference. It was never about like reducing the number of cases. And then, so after we had the whole flatten the curve thing, and the 3 weeks went by, and then they were like, well, we're not going to end these lockdown measures. We're going to keep them. But now the justification had changed, and it was, oh, we need to reduce the number of cases. Well, that was, there's no science behind that whatsoever.
Right.
And in fact, that is that policy probably led to more deaths than had they just taken just not to let the lockdown advocates like to say, well, lockdown opponents think that we should just let the virus run its course and run rampant through the population, and that's not what anyone has been saying. I mean, there's sensible measures we can do to try to reduce transmission, and but to try to this idea that we just have to stop all transmission altogether. Like, why should we try to stop all transmission among people who are at very, very low risk? I mean, that's precisely how you build up population immunity, which is precisely how those people at high risk are going to be protected. That's how the epidemic ends. That's how an
Right.
epidemic ends, is herd immunity, period. And so, why would you try to prevent herd immunity, right? Why would you try to prevent people who are at low risk from getting disease? All you're doing in that case is, like, so if you allow people who are at low risk to go out and live their lives and build population immunity, that is sustainable. And in a quite short period of time, you would have had this level of immunity where then people, it's very hard to like indefinitely keep people in isolation. And
Right.
so, you're by trying to suppress transmission period, and trying to uh, essentially, this kind of indiscriminate policy of just locking everyone down and quarantining healthy people and quarantining people who are at low risk. You're not able to protect those at high risk. Everyone's still
Right.
at equal risk, and it really has done nothing to prevent mortality, to reduce mortality. And there's studies on this. I mean, there's many studies now that show that there's no association between more extreme lockdown measures and better outcomes, whether looking at case numbers or looking at deaths. The lockdowns did not have an effect. In fact, they might be associated with worsened outcomes just looking at COVID-19 deaths, because they really did nothing to protect those at highest risk, especially like elderly people living in nursing care homes.
Right.
Um, and that's to say nothing about the harms of the lockdowns. So
Of
we
course.
know this is also completely uncontroversial, that these measures have, you know, unspeakable harms that are caused. Yeah, whether you're looking at developed countries or looking globally, or you're looking at developing countries, where the UN has estimated, frightening increase in infant mortality and deaths due to starvation and wasting, just malnutrition as a result of global lockdown policies and the
Yeah.
disruption to the economy. So it's very easy to make the case that the lockdowns have done far more harm than good. That is a
Right.
very easy case to make,
I
because
mean, not
that's
to
what the
mention
data that's
things.
what the data say.
Right. Right. I mean, like, not to mention things like, addiction issues or like mental health issues, which have already been skyrocketing since the sort of start of the pandemic and the start of all these lockdowns, right? So, like, that's another aspect of the sort of cost that we pay, that, that should be like taken into like consideration.
Right.
I just wanted to like touch space on one thing that you had actually mentioned on like one of your articles, is that the sort of vaccine program is an extreme position, right? And it's an indication of a totalitarian setup. And you also mentioned that the sort of desired outcome of this pandemic was the sort of mass vaccination program, right? Like, so apart from potential profit, right? Like, what would be the end goal of like such a sort of program? Like, why would the sort of government and sort of public health officials want to have vaccination as the sort of end goal? Like, why would they sort of select this course of action versus what you are suggesting? Like, what would be their incentives?
Corruption. Uh, it's I like to refer to it as the vaccine religion.
Right.
The public policy is essentially it's dogma. It's not science. I mean, when they say that we have to mass vaccinate every child for measles, or we have to mass vaccinate every child for pertussis, this is not this is not a scientific position. This is an expression of faith. And so when they, what science says, to be clear, science says is that there is an individual risk benefit analysis that needs to be done for every
Right.
vaccine and every individual. Period. That's what science says. Couldn't be clearer. So anyone who's saying that, well, we have to have this one size fits all solution, that is an unscientific position. It is an extreme
Right.
position. Okay. So
Right.
when I describe it as being extreme, that's what I'm talking about. It is extreme, and it is indiscriminate, and it ignores the need. It ignores the fact that the risks might outweigh the benefits for some people, depending on their
Right.
circumstances, depending on their genetics, depending on their health status. There's a lot of factors that need to be considered, and no bureaucrat, nobody in Washington, D.C., nobody in any state capital, no government officials have the requisite knowledge to be able to do a meaningful risk benefit analysis on behalf of every other individual in the population. That is just
Right.
simply as a logical truism, they don't know. They don't have the knowledge to be able to do that, and yet that's what they're doing. They're saying, we know better, we know best, you need to get the vaccine. We've done the risk-benefit analysis, and we say that the benefits outweigh the risks. They do not know that, and that is extreme. That position is extreme. It's ignorant. It's unscientific. It's dangerous.
Right.
And the thing is with these vaccines, they have gone, there's phase 3 trials still underway, and they had initial data that the FDA authorized. They're authorized for emergency use, which basically just granted the pharmaceutical companies permission to distribute their vaccines across state lines and to sell them, to market them.
Well, as of just a sort of few hours ago, and I was just seeing this on like Twitter, AstraZeneca actually is now not being recommended, quote unquote, for people under 50, right? So there's always that issue of trial and error that's constantly taking place, even as they're administering these vaccines throughout to like multiple to like people of all age groups across the sort of globe, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
like that's a sort of serious ethical issue. But
Yeah.
just to play but just to play devil's advocate on one point that you mentioned, and you said that the sort of vaccine program is not a one size fits all approach, right? And I would agree with that. However, that being said, most people, may or may not have the sort of time, resources to sort of scourge through through the sort of plethora of sort of medical journals and information studies that are out there to sort of recommend what to or to sort of make an informed choice about which vaccines might or might not suit themselves or their children. So are there any like studies to like sort of show that if like left to their own devices, uh, people, societies in like general take the sort of right decision, and that leads to like increased or actually decreased rate of mortality for the people? Like, are there any studies to like sort of show that piece?
To compare outcomes from like infection versus outcomes from vaccination.
Yeah, to like sort of compare where vaccines are not necessarily mandated by the state authorities versus where sort of vaccines are mandated by the some state authorities, right? So in sort of one situation, parents are given the sort of freedom to sort of pick and choose along with their attending physicians, with their like family doctor, etc. And in the other case, it's sort of it's mandated by the sort of state government, right? Like, have we seen one approach do better than the other? Like, are there any like studies to record the sort of health rates and the sort of rate of mortality for when the choice was left to the individuals?
Uh, that raises a really good. I mean, that's a really good question. But the thing is we don't. There's not a lot of studies looking at those types of questions. So, for example, there's never been a study comparing health outcomes in children who have been vaccinated according to the CDC schedule and children who remain completely unvaccinated. We don't have
Right,
those studies. We don't have that data, and they don't want to
right,
do those studies. But since you brought it up, that was actually the topic of my most recent article. Um, that there was a study published on November 22nd, last year, 2020, so not that long ago, a few months ago,
right,
um, using data from the clinic of a doctor named Dr. Paul Thomas in Portland, Oregon. And he got institutional review board approval to use his clinical data for research and publication. They published the data, and this was at the request actually of the Oregon Medical Board, because he is a doctor who respects informed consent. And so he has a lot of patients pediatric patients whose parents choose not to vaccinate or not to vaccinate strictly according to the CDC schedule. The state doesn't like that. The state doesn't like to see those, you know, quote unquote, under vaccinated populations.
right,
He published his data, and he did a comparison showing health outcomes between his totally unvaccinated children and the children who were variably vaccinated. And the data was absolutely starkly clear that the healthiest children in his practice are those who've never received a single vaccine. And we're talking about things like uh, other infections, the so-called non-vaccine preventable infections.
right.
So things like this, they have lower rates of infections, lower rates of ear infections. They have lower rates of asthma and allergies, and he had none of his unvaccinated children had ADHD, which is quite phenomenal considering the national rates. Um, and so, just right, autoimmune diseases, all kinds of chronic illnesses that uh, the childhood population is really suffering from these days. They're epidemic rates nationally, and
Right.
yet his unvaccinated kids in his clinic are superbly healthy by all
Right.
indications. But that's what the data very strongly indicate. And so that's one glimpse into the part of the problem is that the public health officials are focused on the wrong outcomes. They're focused on we need to maintain these high vaccination rates, and they're just assuming that that's the best thing for health for health outcomes. But they don't have the data to show to prove that that's the best thing for health outcomes. It's
Right.
an assumption. It's a belief. It's a faith. And
Got
this
it.
is why I refer to it as the vaccine religion because it's dogma. They don't have the data to show that. And this is a big problem with COVID-19 vaccines. Is again the point I was making earlier. So they have this preliminary data from trials, but again they're looking at for one, it's short-term effects and acute adverse events. Looking at maybe a couple of months. It was 2 to 3 months at that point when that preliminary data was released that these trials had been underway. You cannot again you cannot have can't stress this enough. You can't weigh the risks and benefits of whether it's right for you to get a vaccine without knowing. I mean, we have all kinds of data on the risks of infection with SARS-CoV-2. So I know personally for myself, being under 50 and without any risk factors that have been identified as any comorbidities that have been identified as risk factors, the risk to me of infection is negligible. I'm willing to accept that risk. I'm not afraid of the virus. I'm really not. The same with everyone in my household. So
Right.
I would prefer to get the infection than the vaccine
Right.
because I don't know. I don't have the data. I don't have the ability to assess the risks from the vaccine because the studies haven't been done. We don't have the data.
Got
Now, if I was elderly and I had comorbidities, if I was 80 and I was, and I had cardiovascular disease or other things, I would probably consider getting the vaccine. But, I mean, I'm not, that's not my personal circumstances.
Got it.
And so, to me, I can't weigh the risk. And as long as I can't weigh the risk of the vaccine, because I don't know, and knowing what I do know about vaccines, it just doesn't make sense to me personally to get it for myself. I'm not saying nobody should get it. I'm not anti-vaccine by any means. I'm pro-informed consent. I think people should make their own judgment based on their own individual risk. And unfortunately, this is not the position of governments. For the most part, they are very much, advocating the COVID-19 vaccines as a one-size-fits-all policy. So they are extremists who are threatening our health and threatening, of course, our freedom. And with now this talk of these immunity passports,
Right.
you won't be able to get a job. You won't be able to go out and live your life. You will not have freedom unless you get the vaccine. And so that you're using coercion. And informed consent cannot happen in the presence of coercion.
Right.
This is a violation of fundamental human rights. And we cannot tolerate this
Yes.
in
I mean,
civilized society.
yeah. I mean, that is a whole different political, situation about, how sort of. Sorry.
Oh, you froze there for a sec. Go ahead. I
Okay.
can
Okay.
see you now.
Sorry. Yeah. So I mean, that's a whole different, sort of political, wrestling match that's like sort of going on between like the sort of where does like the liberties end and how far can the sort of government go to sort of push its sort of residents and citizens. But that's a sort of different, completely different argument, right? Like that's taking the sort of discussion from the scientific realm, which is where I think your expertise fits so well into the sort of political realm, right? Which is again a sort of little more murkier. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all that I had. I mean, your insights were extremely helpful, and yeah, thank you for your time, sir. And I like really really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.